So, of course, with the release of Tears of the Kingdom, a lot of discussion has had recently about what we expect from a sequel, what we want from a sequel, and I think you can either go down the Tears of the Kingdom route or you can go down the complete opposite route, which I will explain in a moment. But what we've done with Tears of the Kingdom is it's doubling down on everything that worked and then adding more stuff. Or you can go down the Jack 1, like Jack and Daxter 1 to Jack 2 route, which is to do something completely different that is barely even resembling the original game, but still be of decent quality. And it actually begs an interesting question because I thought about this a while as well. Because I was thinking about Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger, and people who didn't like Cross because it wasn't Chrono Trigger 2. And it's this idea of if you order, you know, a soup and someone gives you like a piece of bread, are you allowed to be upset that it's not what you ordered initially? So I think it's a bit of an interesting question is like, what do you expect from a sequel and what do we want from sequels just in general? Matt, what would you want from a sequel to a game that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind either way, I guess, in the sense that all I kind of care about is the game good? um, I mean, I know that's a fairly simple standard to expect, but really, I'm happy for a game to be a continuation of an existing story, direct continuation with exactly the same mechanics and all of this. Keep a lot of the material the same as long as it's a worthwhile addition to the story. I'm also happy to play a sequel that is like totally different and tries things that are wildly different. Um, I guess like the Tears of the Kingdom discussion has been interesting to me because the one criticism that I have really seen from multiple sources is the fact that the base world is the same, and a lot of people didn't feel the inspiration to explore what they'd already explored in Breath of the Wild, which wasn't an
I'm like that.
which
I don't really want to explore Tears of Kingdom, and I'm not really like as you say, it's more lived in, but like I'm like not really wanting to explore and find those little added in bits and pieces. Like I just want to do the main game, like it, and the rest of it, the add-on bits like the sky and the ground. So far, everything I've done is just like it just doesn't feel as coherent as the actual main overworld. And then because of that, I don't want to explore those other two places because I feel like the overworld, which we've already been on, the changes to that are more coherent to what the other two bits and pieces are. So yeah,
yeah, I mean, I can't comment because I haven't played Breath of the Wild. But in theory, I would have no problem returning to the Tears of the Kingdom world again for a third one if there was a third one, and being in that position where I'm going through the same kind of overworld. I would think, if they changed it too much, the Zelda series has this issue where if they change things too much, they don't really feel like sequels anymore to previous games. They have the Final Fantasy effect where Ocarina of Time, for example, doesn't have the same feeling as Wind Waker or whatever. They don't feel like they belong. They're not direct sequels to one another. So the fact that with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, they actually decided to make it an explicit sequel, um, was interesting to me. If I had played Breath of the Wild, I don't think I would have minded exploring it again for the purposes of the sequel for what they were doing with that concept of the two games back to back. But at the same time, I'm trying to think of an example where sequel changes things considerably. um, well, I mean, a good example, I guess, would be Xenoblade Chronicles. We were talking about that there. The sequels are all connected to one another in terms of the narrative, but Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 have significantly different feeling to them.
They are vastly different games, yeah.
So even though they are connected in terms of the narrative, the experience of playing those is different. And I didn't mind that either. So I can go either way depending on how they execute on it. And another good example is the Dark Souls series. Those 3 games are all connected, but even though they share some kind of the mechanics of how they played, they feel substantially different to play, and kind of take place in a different place and time to one another. So, yeah, I'm happy for either way, really. I guess there is the potential, I guess, for games that are too directly similar to the ones that came before. The big problem I see with that is, for people who didn't play the original, is it possible to step into the sequel? If you're going to make a direct sequel with the same characters, the same world, and same mechanics, if you are you essentially assuming that people have played the first one? And if so, you're kind of limiting yourself in terms of the audience.
Yeah, it's it's interesting because you don't want to isolate your existing fan base, but you also don't want to just make a game for only them.
Well, that's the thing. You
So
kind
there's
of, it becomes a point of diminishing returns, and Final Fantasy 13 is a really good example of that. You can't play Lightning
it's
Returns without having played the previous 2. You really need to have played Final Fantasy 13, then Final Fantasy 13 2, before you even think of stepping into Lightning Returns. And I think part of the
it has
reason
the
that,
One Piece issue
yeah, I think the problem with
or like
Lightning
the Bleach
Returns
issue.
and the reason it sold so poorly was because Square Enix was basically saying, well, this game is for existing fans, but the existing fan base was kind of whittling away from the first 2 games anyway. So by the time you got to the third one, the core audience that was left was quite small. So there is always that risk, if you're going to make direct sequels, that you're only going to be able to appeal to existing players. Another example of that is the Atelier Ryza series. And the Atelier series kind of does both, where 2 games might be the games tend to change cast and gameplay style and everything dramatically from one to the next. But then sometimes they do direct sequels. So the Atelier Ryza series is a good example of that. That you've got 3 of them, and the third one assumes that you've kind of played the first 2, which means that it probably didn't sell as well as the first 2, because you're always going to lose some players, and if you're not going to pick up new players in the process, then the audience size is going to be smaller. So there is that commercial risk, I guess, which is kind of unique to video games. I don't think film has the same problem. But yeah, video games definitely have that challenge, that you're asking a lot of time from players. And if you're asking them to play entire games before they can step into a new one, the question of whether it's worth it or not becomes a big issue.
Yeah, and there's too much to invest in it that it's so daunting to even try to understand it. I think there's more of an issue with that narratively than there is with gameplay. Because with gameplay, you can always teach a player like in a tutorial, but with narrative, you have to have read or experienced or viewed something for, let's be real here, in terms of video games, hours upon hours. So I don't know. For me, a good sequel should always add something without taking away the soul of what made the last one good.
Hmm. I mean, I think a
And
good example
I
of,
use Jack and Daxter and Jack 2 for that because while they are vastly different games, they still share this similar sort of like spirit behind them. You can still like get the same sort of game feel, but it's just recontextualized in a Grand Theft Auto game.
game
And I
feel.
think that's really interesting. Yeah, it's hard for me to describe it. I'm sorry. It's the
Game
worst
feel. I
descriptive
hate that
language.
term. I hate that term.
I know.
It's just such a clumsy term. But I
And
think,
the other thing as well is like games where there's like a direct sequel and it requires a lot of prior learning. Yeah, is like a lot of people don't finish video games, especially really long, like 40 up to, I mean, 40 is probably a tame amount of hours these days, like, games which are 200 hours long sort of thing. And if your game, if most people are dropping off around hour 80 or hour 40, and then suddenly your sequel's like, you need to know everything which happened in hour 180 to 120 sort of thing from the last game to like understand this game completely, it's not really going to be a coherent experience.
And something that made me quite giggle actually, in the beginning of the Tears of the Kingdom, where you have full stamina bar full hearts, and I want to know how many people actually had that. Like at the end of Breath of the Wild, how many people actually had their Link be at full hearts and full stamina? Because I doubt that it was more than like 5%. It was
I,
a
mi-
big
I
game.
I
Oh,
miss the days where
close.
you could do save imports, like you could transfer your character over from one to the next. Those were the days.
Oh yeah,
Back on
Well,
the
Tears
that
of
was
the
PC,
fun.
Kingdom's brought your horses. So if you all your horses are across in the sequel, so you can like I've
Mm.
got Epona from the Amiibo, so I've got that. That's fun.
but yeah, I mean, you have a good point there, Trent. I guess if you're going to do a direct sequel, then your goal needs to be to either explain things to a player who hasn't played the originals in a very succinct way at the start, or just use the same characters, but make the plot so separated from the original that it doesn't really matter. And I think probably a good example of that, I don't think that they're particularly good games, but the Horizon series was pretty effective in that if you hadn't played the original Horizon, then the sequel's opening chapter did a decent enough job of catching you up on what had happened, and then also then throwing you into a completely different space. So the plot of the original wasn't particularly relevant to what was happening in the sequel. So I
Kind of like
think,
the Tomb Raider games. Like Tomb Raider does that. Like every one in that Microsoft series was sort of like still really linked together, but it was like here's a completely different plot.
well, another good example of that is the Uncharted series. You don't need to have played any particular Uncharted to pick up any of the other ones. They still have the same character, Mr. Drake, but and the same basic gameplay mechanics, but they're all kind of succinct, separated stories from one another. So, um, yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know, like the Indiana Joneses, I guess, that you don't necessarily need to have seen any of them to watch any of the other ones. It's kind of the same with Uncharted. So, yeah, it's definitely possible to keep using the same characters and the same basic gameplay mechanics without having to make a direct sequel that people need to have played the original to be able to play the sequel. And I think that's really the biggest problem is when you do that, when you just assume that people have played a game beforehand.
Well,
It's
all those games you mentioned, they all got one thing in common, especially with like stuff like Indiana Jones, is their big core mechanic is exploration. Like you're needing to explore and learn about the game once you're basically comfortable with it. So you're sort of learning and picking up what the game wants to tell you anyway.
they're all take place in different spaces. So the fact that you're exploring a space for the first time, doesn't necessarily rely on having explored the previous spaces.
Yeah, well, I
Um,
could say something like
But
Tears
there's
of
something to also
yeah. I was going to say
there's
Tears
something
of
to that
Kingdom
though.
utilize that same sort of space, and it doesn't really like if for example like as much as I hate it, like you're not really like it's sort of like you learn things from either game. You don't really need to know a lot from Breath of the Wild to get Tears of Kingdom. Like it works that way as well.
yeah, I mean, having different abilities in Tears of the Kingdom was probably a good idea
I miss the
because,
bombs though. I really want bombs back.
yeah, because that meant that people who hadn't played Breath of the Wild weren't at a disadvantage because everybody was learning the new set of skills from the start.
Yeah, I think mechanically it's a lot more like flexible because you can explain why a character has new abilities, but you can't explain why they don't remember the stuff from a 40-hour adventure that happened last year in their own timeline. So I think that's kind of where I I really enjoyed Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and the DLC behind it because the DLC was originally meant to be part of the main game, but they turned it into a prequel instead. Um, And throughout the whole main game, you're constantly told stories about why, Torna was important, why this was important, why that was important. And it's made very, very clear that this was a defining feature of this world. And it's not necessary to the main game at all, but it is a sequel to Xenoblade 2. But it's also like its own thing. And I kind of really like that. Because gameplay wise, it's very, very separate. And I would say better than Xenoblade 2. But it's not limited by anything that we don't already know. To the point that you could play Torna without having played Xenoblade 2 quite comfortably, because it is so self-contained. It's a pretty short, straightforward story that isn't trying to, be massively, different to the rest of the series. And it's still easy to, I guess, explain, because all you really need to know is that there's a guy who's evil and go get him. And that's pretty straightforward. If you wanted to, and if you wanted to really delve deep into it, you could in your own time. And the game kind of respects that. And I kind of like that a lot because of it. And it's the same thing that I think is actually done really well with, this is going to sound insane, with TF2. Because Team Fortress 2 has a lot of stuff as a sequel that is related to Team Fortress 1, but it's so just not, it doesn't make it a problem if you don't know it. It's still like, oh yeah,
Who
you're still
played
playing
Team
an online
Fortress
game.
though? Everyone got the orange box. Everyone played Team
I
Fortress
played
2.
Team Fortress. I played the mod on Half-Life.
No, everyone was playing the good games like Unreal Tournament and those sort of
You
Quake.
didn't like the Australian modding scene, that's all I need to know. Robin
Like,
I
Walker
tell
out here
you,
making a banger game.
one example of a sequel that I really did enjoy, and I've kind of appreciated it more and more in the years since, is Final Fantasy X2, 10-2. Um,
Yeah,
I really
the
love
gameplay's really good in
I
that. The
really love
story
the way
isn't
that they
there.
use that as an opportunity to show a different side of the characters. Same characters, but put them in a different situation. Show, well, firstly, because Final Fantasy X was such a long kind of journey, and you really connected with the characters and the world itself as well. It did a good job of presenting a really interesting world, and the events were particularly dramatic. So I really liked the opportunity to see the aftermath of that in Final Fantasy X
Yeah.
too, which was great. But more importantly, it was a really good opportunity to see different side of these characters, and see the consistency between the characters was still good. They were still the same characters, but you did see what they were like in a situation outside of the plot of the original. So I thought that was a
Well, there
really
wasn't this
clever.
impending threat of like death. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and the kind of I mean, the whole point of Final Fantasy X-2 was that organized religion had basically faded away because, to a great extent, because the people realized that the organized the church was essentially very evil. Um, and then
Oh,
it
who
was
would have
kind
seen
of
that coming?
it was kind of replaced with pop culture, and there was a commentary in there about the real world as well. That was kind of the point of it. But yeah, these characters are now in a world in which pop culture is kind of the dominant religion as such, and what that did to them and the world around them and all of that kind of stuff. It was a really interesting way of having a kind of compare and contrast between the two games, and I liked that you had that consistency of the world and the characters, but you use the sequel as a way to look at things from a different perspective. So um, I can't
Yeah.
think of too many other examples that have done that. Um,
This is probably really bloody hard to do, to be honest with you.
well, yeah, it certainly requires a lot of creative thought, but video games are meant to be an art form. There's meant to be artists working in the video games. You'd think there'd be a few more creatives out there,
You did
but
just play Gollum. I don't know if that's true.
it's true. I
you
did
know
just
what
play
would be
Gollum.
interesting, based off like what Matt's trying to say, is like, say for example, I'm going to use Zelda as an example. Say for example, you didn't do the Terrytown side quest in Breath of the Wild. What if, like, as a major change, you get into Tears of Kingdom, it covers across your save, and you go to where Terrytown should be, and it's just not there. And that whole area, like all the mechanics and ideas around that section in Tears of Kingdom, are just completely different because you did not build Terrytown in the original game. That would be fun.
That would change the game that much, though. Like realistically,
Well, I
No,
mean,
but it
a
would be like
Zelda,
a fun mechanic, like
a Zelda,
idea.
a Zelda example of that would be Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, because remember, Majora's Mask is an actual sequel to
there's nothing to do with
Ocarina of,
it. Yeah,
but again, it kind of it takes the same character and the same world as such, but puts it in a very different space. And through doing that, we get to see a different side of the character, and that's what I like with sequels, is the opportunity to continue not just the story, but also to use it as an opportunity to look at things in a different way. And I think that's what a lot of developers miss, that too often a sequel is just a continuation of an existing story, a new chapter as such. Whereas I think the better approach to sequels is to use them as an opportunity to challenge and kind of think differently about the world. And I know it's
What
not
about games like, say, Persona 5? Like, it's not necessarily a sequel, but the big thing was that DLC, that second part where they re-released the game, was essentially like, we've done so many changes. All the people which played Persona 5, you want to play that new version. Like, what about games where that is the core idea, that it's not necessarily a sequel, but a re-release, and it relies on people having, because it's such a short time up later, it relies on people playing the original game to sort of carry across to the new game. And then, like in Persona's 5's case, I don't really think all the added extra bits really justified playing the 200-hour game or whatever it is these days to experience that. But what if a game did that successfully and said, okay, well, we've done all these changes, and mechanically and story wise, you're going to experience the game in a whole new way because these are injected in parts which you played before.
I don't think Persona 5 is a good example of that. I mean, I think that was done for reasonably cynical reasons. What probably happened with Persona 5 was the development time meant that they had to release the original as it was, but they had all this material that they wanted to use that they didn't get into the original release because of timelines. And then they saw the opportunity to do the royal version and add that in. So I feel like that was done for fairly cynical reasons. But to your point, a good example of that, what you're talking about, would probably be Final Fantasy VII Remake or Stranger of Paradise as well, where they're not technically sequels, but they're they're a they're a response to the original. So Final Fantasy VII Remake is not a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, but it is a game that uses Final Fantasy VII in a way that it reworks it in a way that means that it's also not a, I mean, calling it a remake is probably incorrect. I would say it's more what's the best way to put it? It's really
Remaster?
just a
Not really.
subversion. It's a subversion of the original Final Fantasy VII. They really do challenge a lot of what happens in Final Fantasy VII within the context of the same story. So I see them as almost like a Final Fantasy X/10-2 kind of comparison, compare and contrast, where you've got the same characters, and in this case, the same kind of overall story, but the the answers or the way that you engage with it is fundamentally different. So yeah, that's a good example of that approach that you're talking about, Trent. Um, but yeah, that's even less common in video games. I can only think of those two, Final Fantasy VII and Stranger of Paradise, that have done things that way. Most of the time, a remake is just a remake. It's not really a pseudo sequel.
Yes, a cash grab to take all your money.
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, we can never forget that the the fundamental driving reason for a sequel is the original was popular enough and sold well enough that they see money
money,
in,
money, money,
yeah,
money.
they see
Yeah,
money in doing another one. And in the video game industry, unfortunately, those things tend to get pushed even further to the point where people get sick of the original and then stop being fans of the whole thing. So yeah,
Yeah,
there
we're
is the
certainly in an
money
era with
consideration.
games where remakes and remasters are certainly happening a lot sooner than what they used to be. Like back in the day, it used to be, oh, okay, we're going to remake this game. It came out in the 80s or it came out in the 90s and it's now like 20 years later. Now it's like, it's a new generation. Oh, actually, not even a new generation sometimes. And it's like, here is the same game you played like at the beginning of the generation. Like, and oftentimes either remastered just faithfully to it for no point at all, it's turned into a games as a service game where it's a downgrade in terms of what you actually get. Like things like Overwatch 2, it's essentially Overwatch 1, but more games as a service for no reason at all. And then you've got like other games where they are starting to put more elements into it and remaster it in a way that's retelling, like, you know, your Final Fantasy. So it is something which is probably going to become more common.
I mean, the
Yeah.
other one example is the Capcom Resident Evil remakes, where they make it more consistent, more coherent, and I kind of like that a lot. I think that they're doing quite well with that. Capcom's doing well. That's the vibe. Well done, Capcom. You're doing it.
Capcom's approach to sequels is pretty interesting. Like I do like the way in general they've handled the Resident Evil series. That
There's always a reason behind a new Resident Evil. It's not just to piss around and do the same thing again.
well, I mean, they're kind of distinct games, right? But they do bring across characters from one to the next, and they keep a consistency in the world and the lore as such. But they do treat each new Resident Evil as an opportunity to do something significantly different. Because Resident
Yeah.
Evil, you've got kind of three chapters, I guess, in the Resident Evil kind of story, and that is Resident Evil 0 through Code Veronica is kind of one era. Then you've got
Yeah.
Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 as the second era, and then you've got 7 and Village as kind of the new era. But across all of that, they've kept the consistency of those characters. There's the Umbrella Corporation is kind of like the Umbrella Evil, which kind of
It's still evil. It doesn't matter.
which is really clever because it means that you've got a consistency in the antagonist within the game series as well. But at the same time, you can have something where you've got Resident Evil 1 and 2, which are set in kind of modern cities and mansions and stuff, all the way to Resident Evil Village, which has this kind of gothic atmosphere, which is entirely different setting. So
Whereas,
the
like, it makes into a game almost for the player. Like, if you've played them previously, it's like, how are they going to involve Umbrella? Whereas if
yeah,
you're
and what's
new,
the
it's a big
relationship?
reveal when Umbrella is involved.
What's the relationship between them? What does this gothic village in the middle of Europe have to do with events in the mansion in Resident Evil 1? There is that each sequel is additive to the overall, which I do like.
Am I the only
I think
one
it's
which
pretty well
like found
managed.
that the movies ruined the experience for the games in terms of like the context and what they're trying to do? Like the movies was all like, you know, here's a sterile world, you're like, and it's like all about what they're doing research and science wise, and you know, it seemed more fun and well, not fun, but it was like moving into really heavily onto the B grade campy style of the movies. And then just the games are just all this gothic horror and stuff like that. And it's like, where's my busting through walls to destroy
Have you played the games, Trent?
Yeah,
Have you played the new ones?
the
I
the
haven't
g-
played seven and eight. No,
yeah.
Okay. When you play 7 and 8, you'll understand why I'm asking you to think about
so
that.
it will be exactly what I want. Is
But
it?
seven to eight
Oh,
is 7 to 8 is a really interesting one, even within that, because 7 is kind of that deep South Texas chainsaw horror style, um, American Gothic, right? And then
yeah.
8 is that more classical Dracula style, haunted
It's more Hammer
haunted town,
horror.
and yeah. So the fact that they feature the same main character, right, and actually do connect to each other in a way that it does feel authentic is really
It's
impressive.
also very satisfying. Yeah, the fact
It's
it's
really
like done in a way
impressive.
that doesn't suck.
So yeah, Resident Evil is a really good example of how to handle sequels over a long time, making sure that the games still stay relevant to the time and they can change.
They have the similar game feel.
They can approach the games in a way that means that they continue to feel relevant without needing to completely, restart every time they start a new game. So
Yeah, exactly. I think it's quite neat.
See, I haven't played a Resident Evil game since like Resident Evil 6 came out, and everyone was all about it's a draft fucking something or whatever. The whole like Bart Simpson Lisa thing for like the Olympics logo. Like that was like the big heavy thing about the game, and that's all I knew about the game and I never knew anything about the actual game itself.
Did you play it?
No, I didn't play it, but I was turned off because of this weird giraffe thing the internet was going on about.
I mean, Resident Evil 6 was the low point of the series by a long way. It was a
You
terrible
say
game.
that, but it has some really good ideas that they've clearly been using in the remakes, and I really like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a fan of 5 or 6. Those are the two that kind of left me. But
Five's really good though.
even then, I still accept that within the context of the overall series, they have a place to play. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the downside to it is that Capcom has kind of locked themselves in. They basically have to make sure that every single one of those games is available on modern platforms. It's not a problem for them. I guess they keep making money from them, but it does mean that even though each of those games can be played separately, you do really want to play them all to get the full context of the series.
You get more out of it, but you
Yeah.
don't need to.
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm saying is you do benefit from playing them all, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
Also, 5 and 6 came out when the 3DS was a thing, and Revolutions was a much better game.
Relations is like totally fine.
Totally fine. No,
It's
it's
a
like
reasonable
game.
game.
They're
Game of the
reasonable.
year.
Nah, they're only
Yeah, they
reasonable.
were totally fine. Revelations
like
2 was better in my opinion, but it was fine.
Street Fighter on the 3DS. It was like, the pinnacle of 3D technology.
So these blubby, like goopy boys
Yes.
flipping around.
Yes.
Yeah.